in this class have had a surgery. That was almost unheard of 30 or 40 years ago, when people 20 years or younger had surgery. I mean, 20 years or younger, 20 years or more ago, the only surgery you had is if you had something like an emergency appendectomy, right? But were people getting their knees scoped or, you know, putting tubes in their ears? No, this stuff did not happen. And I'm not saying that you, I'm definitely not saying you kids nowadays, you guys are so wimpy. No, I'm saying this is a good thing, right? This is a good thing that you want to spend more money on it. But of course, we're spending a lot of our money on health now because that's something that's really valuable to us, right? There's also, some very perverse incentives in the system. One of the more perverse incentives is that the average person will spend 50% of their lifetime health expenditure in the last 6 months of their life. That is a statistic that's hard to wrap your mind around. In the last 6 months of your life, you spend half of your lifetime health expenditure. Zach says nursing homes. Well, nursing homes and everything, right? A lot of our health expenditure is really directed at end of life, prolonging people's lives at the very end. And so, you know, listen, I don't want to be very macabre about this and not too much like an economist by thinking everything is cost benefit, but you really do have to wonder if our present system balances the cost versus the benefits of this, right? Where we're spending an awful lot of money to prolong people's lives for just sometimes weeks, right? A lot of this is related to something else, which is new technologies. New technologies are expensive. Why? Well, I'm going to make the argument it has something to do with diminishing marginal returns. What's happened to all those easy ideas for prolonging your life? Like having a sewer system, washing your hands after you eat, when somebody gets the flu, giving them an IV, vaccinations. Those ideas have all been taken, right? We've got those ideas. Now, what are the ideas that are needed to extend life? Well, cancer research, okay? There's big time diminishing marginal returns. Can you extend average life through cancer research? You can, but you're not going to extend it a lot, and it's going to be very expensive. And so once again, as we move to extend life, it's going to require more and more research, more and more resources. Now, maybe there is some great idea out there. Zach puts in the chat stem cells. You know, there very well might be some great idea that dramatically improves healthcare at a very small fraction of cost. That's possible. But I don't think it's likely, right? And if it does happen, it's most likely to be a once in a lifetime thing, right? Then in general, we've hit the stage of diminishing marginal returns in terms of healthcare. Yes, we can extend life, but it's going to cost us a lot to do that. And then finally, there's the problem of moral hazard in health insurance. Anybody remember what moral hazard is? I think we talked about this maybe on Friday, actually. Remember what moral hazard is?
Didn't we talk about it in connection with how the banks were bailed out and that just encouraged bad behavior?
Right. So when you reward bad behavior, you only incentivize more of it. Now, I said it in terms of Friday and bad behavior. But let me just say, you could also think about this not in terms of bad, but in terms of risky behavior. Okay? I am convinced that there would not be a sport of snowblowing or snowboarding if it wasn't for health insurance. Why? Because if everybody had to pay for themselves the cost of all the injuries that come from snowboarding, they probably would be less likely to do it. But in general, if you wreck your knee snowboarding, who pays? Your insurance company does. Now, of course, you pay for that when you buy insurance, but you don't necessarily directly pay for all the costs of your risky behavior. So what I'm trying to say here is that health insurance is necessary, right? Because health is a potentially ruinous cost to many families. We understand why insurance is necessary. But the fact that it's insurance that causes it to incentivize expensive or risky behavior. So why is it, in part, that Americans have on average 9 surgeries during their life? In part because they don't directly pay for them, right? We kind of don't, we pay for our insurance, but then we do not pay the direct cost of the healthcare that we get. That incentivizes us to use more of it, either because we get things done that maybe don't necessarily need to get done if we were paying for them ourselves, or because it encourages us to do riskier things. So what I am not saying here is I am not saying that health insurance is a bad thing. What I am saying is that the market for health insurance is very complicated, right? There's a lot going on here. And so it is here in Medicare that has the most potential to potentially be ruinous for the US budget. Because if health costs keep on going up with an aging population, we could, definitely reach the point where we can't afford it. Now, let me give you the good news, bad news. The US spends twice as much on healthcare as any other rich country. And for it, we get worse outcomes. The US, as a percent of GDP, spends twice as much as most European countries do on healthcare, and we get worse outcomes for it. Our healthcare system is an unmitigated disaster. When people tell you that we have the best healthcare system in the world, we have the best healthcare system in the world for people with unlimited resources. Outside of that, it is not the best healthcare system in the world. So this is the bad news, but why am I saying this is also the good news? It's good news because if we actually ever got serious about fixing our healthcare system, we could do a lot better, right? We could do a lot better than this. And so the fact that we do so bad about this is actually, to me, some sense of good news in that, we could do, one of the ways that we could greatly improve our government budget situation and actually the productivity of the US economy would be to move to a more efficient healthcare system. And I'm not a healthcare economist, but everything that I know suggests that moving to some form of single payer system you get a lot more bang for your buck in single payer systems. No country in the world has a healthcare system like the US does, where basically employers are responsible for your healthcare. it's a crazy system. It is not a system that any sane economist would design. And so, without getting onto a big, long tangent here about, what a better healthcare system would look like, let's just say that ours doesn't look very good. All right, ours doesn't look very good. And if you were designing one from scratch, you would not do what the US does. Well, are we going to have a debt crisis in the US?
I don't think so, because we have really good institutions. We have a really good financial system.
Right. There is no doubt that we have good institutions and lots of debt tolerance. How would we know if the US was beginning to lose its debt tolerance? In other words, how would we know if we were getting close to the point of having a debt crisis? What would be the clues that we'd want to look for?
It'd be harder for us to borrow.
Right. And to this point, has it been hard for the US government to borrow? Absolutely not, right? We just had a $2 trillion stimulus package a few months ago. How hard was it for the US to sell $2 trillion worth of bonds? No problem. What would be another clue that it was getting hard for the government to sell bonds? What would they have to be doing if the market was drying up for these bonds? How would you make a bond more attractive to buyers?
Lower the price.
You lower the price by doing what to the interest rate? Increase interest rate, right? That's what Sonny said, increase interest rates. So we would expect interest rates to be going up if the government was having a hard time borrowing money. In fact, what are we seeing? Interest rates are at 20-year lows in the US. And in fact, if we look at the interest payments relative to the size of GDP, we are actually spending less on interest as a percent of our GDP than we were 20 years ago. That doesn't sound like a country that's going to have a debt crisis, right? I mean, we're actually paying less in many ways than we were 20 years ago. To me, the key is, can you continue to grow? Is what you're buying with the debt going to foster future growth? If it is, then it's okay to take on debt. Just like for you, is it okay for you to borrow to go to college? I think so. Because hopefully this will increase your future income so much that it will be relatively easy for you to pay back that debt, right? And you will gain from it. Well, really, the same question exists for the government. It's not really a question of whether they should take on debt as what do you do with the debt? are you making the kind of investments that are needed? And so, one of the things that is being talked about and watching right now is Joe Biden has this plan, this big infrastructure plan, right? And it's basically asking the US government to borrow $2 trillion, right? $2 trillion, which is a lot of money, to make some big investments in public transportation, in public health, in kind of family services, in education, right? Make some very, very big investments. And so, Biden's argument is interest rates are so low, this is the time for us to spend on this stuff, right? Where we can borrow money so cheaply, let's borrow it and spend it on stuff, right? And so then the question really comes back to, do you think that's the things that we should be spending money? Do you think that they have productive benefits for the economy? If you think that the government can increase growth by spending more on education or building more public infrastructure, then that would be a good idea. You probably support Biden's plan. If, on the other hand, you're somebody who doesn't see a lot of value in these things, then, maybe you're not so excited about that. But, to me, to some extent, when we debate about debt and deficits, that's a little bit kind of like, not keeping your eye on the right ball, right? I mean, an obsession with debt and deficits is probably not what you want to obsess on. Probably what makes more sense is, how are you spending the money and how are you going to pay for it, right? So in other words, how do we collect taxes? How do we spend the money? If you get that part right, then the deficit is less important, right? And so, yeah, I think most economists do not think that we're anywhere close to having a debt crisis, right? Because, basically the markets are telling us that. Of course, could this change? Sure. I mean, you never want to say never in economics, right? And one of the things that we talked about this morning was that all of this gets down to debt tolerance. And tolerance is really a function of credibility and confidence. And the problem with confidence is it can be fleeting, right? I mean, something could happen tomorrow that could shake the market's confidence in the government, right? Whether it was, who knows what it could be, right? And so I guess you never want to say never, right, as an economist. But there certainly is no indication right now that markets think that U.S. government debt is anything but a good investment, right? In fact, people continue to buy it. And by the way, not just people in the U.S., but people outside of the U.S., right? A big chunk of our debt is held by foreigners who still see U.S. government debt as one of the best bets, one of the safest ways to save. And so as long as they feel that way, then it's hard to see how the U.S. could have a debt crisis. Okay, well, that gets us to the end of chapter 13. I do have a couple of end of chapter questions at the end of chapter 13 that I wanted to give you. If anybody wants to do a little bit of extra practice problems tonight, right? If you want to do the end of chapter questions, I just picked out a couple that I thought looked particularly good, right? And so here's just a few. If you feel like you want to get a little bit more practice, or if you have a little bit of time tonight to study, and you feel like working problems is an effective way for you to study, you might want to do these questions, or at least work through them with somebody. So tomorrow, we're going to have quiz number 4. What's going to be on quiz number 4? 2 chapters. Chapter 12 on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And there's actually a lot in chapter 12, right? There's a lot in chapter 12. And then chapter 13, what we talked about today on fiscal policy. So that will be on the quiz tomorrow. I'm actually probably going to write you a little bit longer quiz tomorrow with maybe a problem or 2 more. So more problems. It's going to be the same number of points, but I'll just ask you some more questions that are worth less points, simply because we've covered so much material here in the last couple of days, giving you a couple of extra questions in preparation for the exam. seemed to make sense to me. So, but other than that, the quiz will look very similar in form to your other quizzes, right? We'll take this tomorrow afternoon. We'll have a little bit of time to review before this, but your quiz will be on these 2 chapters. And then tomorrow morning, we're going to talk about chapter 14 on Fed and the money supply. So that will be the focus of class tomorrow morning. That will not, what we cover tomorrow morning will not be on your quiz in the afternoon. All right, any questions about any of that stuff? Okay, well, then that's really all the new material that I have. So I think at this point, I'm just going to kind of leave it up to your own recognizance. If you don't feel like you want to listen to the review or don't have any questions, feel free to go spend some time studying or doing other productive things. I'm going to hang out here for a few minutes. And so if people want to ask some questions or if you just want to talk to me individually, I'm happy to talk to you, right? But I don't really have any new material or anything new planned for us the rest of the afternoon, okay? So anyway, yeah, for those of you who take off, thanks a lot, and we'll see you in the morning. And then for those of you who want to stay here, ask away, ask them some questions or anything that you might have.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
What are some good practice problems for chapter 12?
Some problems for chapter 12. I think I had those in your...
Yeah, it's on the email.
It's on the
Okay.
email.
Great, thank you.
Let me find it.
It's 1, 2, 4, 7, 9, 11, and 14.
1, 2, 4, 7, 9, 11, and 14, right?
Yeah,
Perfect,
that's what.
thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Did anybody have a chance to work any of those problems? Do they have any questions about it?
I have a question about chapter 12, like kind of in general.
Okay, sure. Go ahead, Gabe.
So a lot about it's like comparing long run to short run.
Mhm.
Talked about in the United States how we're like always in short run. So I was wondering if it's like possible to like ever be in long run. They said like that's the overall goal, but it's like never actually at long run.
Okay, so I don't think that's a good way to think about it. To me, that's a very confusing way to think about it. Okay, when we think about the long run, we're talking about long run average behavior over long periods of time. Okay? So that's the long run, average behavior over long periods of time. The short run, though, is more day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year behavior. In other words, deviations from our long run behavior. So maybe think about it this way. I apologize up front for using a sports analogy, but you know, let's say you're a baseball player, right? You got some baseball player. He is a lifetime 290 hitter. Okay, he's been in the big leagues 12 years, 290 hitter. What's his long run batting average? 290. Okay, but what could he be hitting today? He could be hitting 300 or he could be hitting 188, right? So the short run behavior is the deviation from his long run behavior, right? So to put this back in the economic context, you could think about the US economy has a long run growth rate of about 2% a year, right? Over the long term, the US economy grows at about 2% a year. But what could be true at any given year in the short run? We could grow at negative 5%, or we could, like we did last year we grew at like negative 6%, or we could grow at positive 3%, right? So that's the short run. The short run is, you're right, it is where we're today. in one sense, we're always in the short run, right? You know, back to baseball terms, you're only as good as your last at bat. That's what coaches will tell you. What they're really telling you is you're always in the short run, right? But there is such a thing as the long run, right? Your long run average behavior. And that's also important for us to understand as economists. But the focus of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is really to help us understand the short run, right? We have that long run aggregate supply curve in there as a way of kind of anchoring us in some of the things that we talked about before, right? About growth and productivity and the big three things that drive growth in the long run. But the focus of the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is really, why are we not always at the long run? Why is it that sometimes we're not at the natural rate of output? Does that help? Okay, but that is a good question, because undoubtedly, understanding this distinction between the short run and the long run is really, really crucial to understanding the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, right? I mean, really, that's at the heart of it in many ways. Okay, who else has got some questions?
Will you talk about why the short run aggregate supply slopes upward and then aggregate demand slopes downward?
Yeah. Okay, we talked about two reasons. The problem of sticky wages and the problem of imperfect information. And both of these really say that wages are slow to adjust, either because wages are sticky or because we just don't have good information about what's going on. So the idea behind sticky wages is, for instance, what happens when there's a cut in the price level? Firms can't cut your wage. They can't, either because there's a wage contract or because they're worried that they're going to lose their best workers. That's that efficiency wage theory. So what does that mean? The real wages go up, and when real wages go up, firms have to do layoffs, and they cut output. Notice there's a positive relationship here. Imperfect information is a similar idea. When the price level goes down, people are fooled. They don't expect it, and real wages go up. This also creates layoffs and cuts in GDP. What do these things have in common? That markets are imperfect. They don't always work efficiently, either because people don't have perfect information or because wages can't adjust. All right, does that make sense, Autumn?
Yes.
Okay. Now you're also interested about aggregate demand. And we talked primarily about two reasons. The interest rate effect and the wealth effect. What's the interest rate effect? What happens when the price level goes down? Well, actually, I'll do it as I did in class. What happens when the price level goes up? This reduces the real value of savings. So our savings supply shifts down and interest rates go up, which reduces consumption, reduces investment, and reduces aggregate demand. Well, I should say reduces GDP. Expenditure, reduces aggregate expenditure. So there's a negative relationship between the price level and aggregate expenditure. The wealth effect is very similar. Here, instead of focusing on the real value of savings, it just says real wealth will also go down, and that will directly reduce consumption and investment and reduce out GDP.
Really quick, what does the lowercase r stand for in the graph again?
Can you say that again? Your audio is not very clear.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you better now.
Sorry, really quick, what does the lowercase r in the graph stand for again?
Interest rate. Yeah, so this is the loanable funds market. So I think I suggested this, maybe I think to you, Krista, on Friday, but I actually think it makes a lot of sense. A good way there's many good things you can do to prepare for the quiz and the exam, but to actually make a sheet in which you have all the facts about aggregate demand there. Why aggregate demand looks like it does. What kind of things shift aggregate demand. Have another sheet about short-run aggregate supply. Why does short-run aggregate supply look like it does? What kind of things shift short-run aggregate supply? And then another sheet about long-run aggregate demand. What kind of things, why does long-run aggregate supply, back up. And a third sheet about long-run aggregate supply, right? Why does it look like it does? What kind of things shift long-run aggregate supply, right? Because that is often a source of confusion, is getting all these things confused, right? Because we really are bringing together a lot of different ideas into this model, right? And as we talked about, models are simple. Well, they're simplified versions of reality, but that doesn't mean they're simple, right? They're simpler than reality, but they can still be plenty complex. And that's certainly true about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So, obviously a big part of the quiz tomorrow is going to be about kind of the mechanics of the model, because I'm very interested in making sure that you get prepared with the mechanics so that then you can understand how to use the model to explain the real world. Who else has got some questions? Okay, I'm going to have a question for you. All right, I got a question for you, and this will be it, unless some other people have some questions.
You aren't showing your screen if you meant to.
Okay. You? Okay, so let's examine the impact of an increase in government spending. Okay, what happens in the short run as a result of this? And then what happens in the long run if the government takes any actions? And can we kind of spell this out? Okay, I'm going to ask you all to walk me through this. Okay, we always begin, whenever you get a problem like this, we always begin at the natural rate, right? We always begin in the long run. So
So
this
an increase in,
So go ahead, Zach.
sorry. So an increase in government spending would be an increase in demand, right?
Right,
Aggregate demand.
right. So aggregate demand goes up. What happens to output? Output actually goes up above the natural rate, and inflation begins to go up. One other thing, though, has happened here, and let's be clear about this. What's happened to the actual price level relative to the expected price level? Right. Actual prices have gone up, but expected prices have not. So notice at this spot that the actual price level is greater than the expected price level. So in the short run, we move here to this blue dot. That's where we are in the blue. How does the economy return to the natural rate in the long run? Who can help walk me through this? What's going to be the next step if the government takes no action here? Government takes no action here. How does the economy get back to the natural rate over time? What do you think, Krista? Okay, well, let me ask you, what's out of balance here? Output is greater than the natural rate, that's out of balance. But really importantly, the actual price level and the expected price level is out of balance, right? Inflation has gone up unexpectedly. So what are people going to do given a little bit of time?
Spend less
Well,
or become more comfortable given time. I don't know.
the first thing they're going to want to do,
Oh, they're adjust the rates.
they're going to adjust their expected price level, right? Because they realize this higher inflation is eating away their wages, right? Inflation's gone up, but they have not adjusted their expected inflation rate, their expected price level. So what are people going to do? They're going to increase their expected price level, and they're going to demand higher nominal wages, right? If we can go back to this graph here, I'll put it in red. Notice what's happened here. real wages went down, right? Because the inflation went up, but nominal wages didn't change because the public didn't expect it. So real wages have gone down here, right? Real wages have gone down because inflation has gone up, but the nominal wage didn't change. So your real purchasing power has dropped. So now the public wants to correct that. They want to demand higher nominal wages and get their real wage back up. What happens when wages go up? That is one of the things that reduces short-run aggregate supply. That's one of the things that we talked about that reduce short-run aggregate supply. And so in terms of our graph, what happens to our short-run aggregate supply curve? It gradually shifts back in this direction. And where do we move? Back to the natural rate. So for a little while, output goes up, but then people catch on to what happened and output goes back down. Will the economy work itself out? Yeah, it will. Why then didn't Keynes like this approach? What did Keynes think the problem with just letting the economy work itself out?
It takes time.
It takes too much time, right? We don't know how long this process would take. Could it take a year, 2 years, 3 years? Maybe. In the meantime, right, things are screwed up. Things are screwed up. And so Keynes would have argued that when aggregate demand got too high, what should the government do? It should just be trying to reduce aggregate demand. Right? So we actually talked about this morning. During an expansion, what should fiscal policy be doing? Cutting government spending and raising taxes. Right? That was the Keynesian approach because he did not like this kind of laissez-faire approach because he thought it took too long and it was not reliable. Okay, so for you hardy souls who are still here, I'm not going to tell you what's on the quiz tomorrow, but I will strongly hint to you that this kind of question, not saying exactly this question, but this kind of question is a strong candidate for being on your quiz tomorrow. Right? Because what this question is asking you to do is kind of walk me through how the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model can explain, a shock to the economy and then how the economy responds to that. So, so I'm not saying exactly this kind of question, but this type of question is a very strong candidate for being on the quiz tomorrow. And quite honestly, on your exam on Thursday. So getting familiar with the mechanics of the model, right? Practice using the model to help you think, right? Using the model to kind of make a prediction and think about the world. That's you're definitely going to get some questions like this.
So like maybe it would be for tonight, would it be good to study by like maybe going over some of the examples we went over in class and then trying to work those through, like, okay, if a scenario like the Great Depression hit, what happened? And then like.
Yeah, that would be good. I think a couple of the questions that are actually at the end of chapter 12 and 13 actually ask you to do some of this stuff. They ask you to draw graphs. Or you could just, if you're studying with somebody, you could just kind of say, hey, let's work through not an increase in government spending, but let's go work through this same thing and this time let's make it a tax cut, right? Or this time let's make it a cut in consumer confidence, or an increase in confidence, right? Or something else that shifts aggregate demand, like an increase in exports, right? Or you could just make a whole bunch of different scenarios and just practice a few of them. Practice talking through, working through the model, kind of going step by step as a way of self-testing whether you kind of understand how all these pieces fit together. Does that make sense? Good. So remember also tomorrow, chapter 13 is on your quiz. Okay, so don't forget about that. However, I will say that, as is true for a lot of stuff this week, it all comes back to aggregate demand, aggregate supply, right? So most of the difficult things that we talked about this morning actually relate to aggregate demand, aggregate supply, right? When it comes to like Keynesian fiscal policy and things like that. But definitely remember to take, spend a little bit of time looking over chapter 13 for the quiz tomorrow. And we'll have a little bit of time to review before the quiz tomorrow too. So if there's some questions that pop up in chapter 13, we can definitely go over those before the quiz tomorrow, okay?
Is our quiz going to be in the afternoon?
In the afternoon. It'll be the same setup, and we'll do it on Google Forms. Yeah, same setup you've come to know and love. Okay, anything else quick? If not, I'm going to let you all go, okay?
I was wondering, like, what chapters are all going to be on the exam on Thursday?
Let me see. So it's going to be chapter 9 on economic growth. And it will be on inequality, our discussion of inequality. And then it will be on chapter 12 on aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Chapter 13, which is what we talked about today on fiscal policy. And then it will include what we talk about tomorrow, chapter 14, on monetary policy and the Fed.
So is chapter 15 not going to be on it?
Chapter 15 we'll save for the final. Sound good? Okay, everyone. Well, have a good afternoon. And we'll see you back bright and early tomorrow morning, okay? All right. Thanks, everyone.